By the end of summer, the most frustrating part of your yard could become the part people notice first. Not because you spent thousands of dollars on a landscape makeover, hired a designer, or suddenly became an expert gardener, but because you finally stopped fighting your yard and started working with it. Every year, around June, countless homeowners reach the same conclusion. They look outside, see bare patches, stubborn weeds, tired flower beds, and unfinished corners. Then assume they've already missed their opportunity. April is gone. Spring planting season feels like a memory, and social media is filled with landscapes that seem months ahead of where their own yard is today. That's usually when motivation begins to disappear. But experienced gardeners eventually learn something important. The biggest mistake isn't starting in June. The biggest mistake is planting without understanding the problem you're actually trying to solve. Beautiful plants fail every day. Not because they're bad plants, but because they're growing in the wrong place. Meanwhile, an average-looking perennial that's perfectly matched to its environment can outperform a far more impressive plant that constantly struggles. That's why this isn't a list of random flowers. Instead, we're looking at some of the most common frustrations homeowners face and the fast-spreading perennials that can help turn those problems into strengths. And one of the biggest frustrations of all begins with a slope. If you've ever owned a property with a hillside, a steep bank, or even a small incline that's constantly causing trouble, then you already know how quickly those areas can become a source of frustration. Rain washes soil downhill, weeds seem to appear overnight, grass struggles to establish itself, and no matter how much effort you invest, the area somehow continues looking unfinished. Over time, many homeowners simply stop trying. The slope becomes that section of the yard they tolerate rather than enjoy, the place they avoid looking at, and promise themselves they'll deal with someday. Now picture that same hillside. Just a few months from now, instead of weeds, waves of color flow across the slope. Instead of exposed soil, a living carpet stretches across the ground. What once felt like an eyesore has become one of the most attractive features on the entire property. That's exactly why creeping phlox has remained a favorite among gardeners for generations. Most people notice the flowers first, and it's easy to understand why. When creeping phlox reaches peak bloom, entire sections of a landscape can appear painted in shades of pink, purple, blue, or white, creating the impression of a river of color flowing across the ground. But the flowers aren't what make this plant valuable. They're simply the reward. The real value comes from what happens before and after bloom. Creeping phlox spreads outward, gradually forming a dense mat that hugs the soil and covers areas that would otherwise remain exposed. As that coverage increases, weeds lose territory, bare patches become less noticeable, and the landscape starts feeling intentional rather than neglected. For homeowners dealing with erosion, that's often the moment everything changes. A slope that once felt impossible begins working with you instead of against you. Of course, no plant is perfect, and one of the biggest mistakes gardeners make is expecting every plant to succeed in every situation. Creeping phlox performs best when it's allowed to spread naturally. If the area serves as a busy pathway, a constant play zone, or a heavily trafficked section of the yard, there may be better options available. But when its strengths match the location, few plants deliver such dramatic results with so little ongoing effort. While some homeowners struggle with what happens above the ground, others struggle with what's happening underneath it. Poor soil has a way of making even enthusiastic gardeners question themselves. You buy healthy plants, follow the instructions, water consistently, and give the landscape your attention. Yet the results never seem to match the promise. Summer heat arrives, the soil dries out, clay becomes stubbornly hard, and the plants survive without ever truly thriving. After a few seasons, many homeowners begin blaming themselves. More often than not, the problem isn't a lack of effort, it's a mismatch. The plants are demanding conditions the property simply doesn't provide. That's where yarrow changes the conversation. There's a reason experienced gardeners continue recommending this plant year after year. It succeeds where many others struggle. Hot summers don't intimidate it, dry conditions rarely slow it down, and poor soil that causes other perennials to decline often becomes the exact place where yarrow proves its value. What makes yarrow especially valuable isn't just its toughness. It's the confidence it gives homeowners. Because once you've spent enough years replacing plants that failed, reliability becomes incredibly attractive. Picture a patch of ground that looked nearly hopeless in early summer, still carrying waves of color through the hottest weeks of the season. While other plants begin fading under heat and drought, yarrow continues doing exactly what it was planted to do. That's the kind of reliability homeowners remember, not because it's dramatic, but because it's dependable. Its clusters of flowers bring lasting color to difficult areas, while attracting pollinators and reducing the feeling that every challenging section of the landscape requires constant attention. And that's a lesson many gardeners eventually learn. Some of the best plants aren't the ones demanding the most care. They're the ones that naturally fit the conditions you already have. Instead of forcing you to fight your environment, they allow you to work with it. And that's often the moment gardening becomes far more enjoyable. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this kind of practical landscaping advice, the kind focused on solving real homeowner problems instead of simply showcasing pretty plants, consider subscribing. The goal isn't to fill your yard with more plants. It's to help you choose better ones. And speaking of problems that can undo months of effort, poor soil isn't the only challenge capable of disappointing a gardener. Sometimes the plants are healthy. Sometimes the flowers are beautiful. Sometimes everything is growing exactly as planned. And then something arrives overnight and starts treating your landscape like a buffet. If you've ever walked outside and discovered half your flower bed missing by morning, you already know exactly where we're headed next. If you've ever walked outside one morning and immediately felt that sinking feeling in your stomach, there's a good chance deer were involved. The night before, everything looked perfect. The flowers were opening, the borders were filling in, and the garden was finally starting to resemble the picture you had in your mind. Then, almost overnight, it looked as though someone had helped themselves to dinner. For many homeowners, deer aren't occasional visitors. They're recurring problems. And what makes them especially frustrating is that they rarely seem interested in the plants you wouldn't mind losing. Somehow, they always find the plants you've been most excited about, the ones you researched, carefully planted, and imagined becoming the stars of the landscape. After enough seasons, many gardeners stop asking which plants look the most beautiful and start asking a much more practical question: which plants actually have a chance of surviving here? Because no matter how beautiful a flower may be, it can't improve your landscape if it disappears every time wildlife moves through the neighborhood. That's where catmint begins earning its reputation. Unlike some perennials that rely on a brief burst of spectacular blooms, catmint offers something many homeowners eventually value even more: consistency. Drive through almost any neighborhood in midsummer, and you'll notice something interesting. Some flower beds already look tired. Some borders are beginning to fade. But every so often, you'll come across a planting that's still carrying soft waves of blue-purple color, with bees moving from bloom to bloom, and the entire space feeling surprisingly fresh despite the heat. That's often catmint. It doesn't demand perfect conditions. It doesn't require constant attention, and it tends to remain attractive long after many other plants have started losing momentum. Heat rarely bothers it. Short, dry spells rarely slow it down. And, perhaps most importantly, deer generally find it far less appealing than many of the alternatives surrounding it. Now, it's important to keep expectations realistic. Deer-resistant is not the same thing as deer-proof. A hungry deer can surprise any gardener, and anyone who's spent enough time gardening knows there are very few absolute guarantees in nature. But when homeowners compare plants that are routinely destroyed with plants that are frequently left alone, catmint consistently rises toward the top of the list. And that's where its real value becomes clear. Not because it eliminates every problem, but because it reduces frustration. While other homeowners are replacing damaged plants and starting over, your borders still have color, structure, and life. The landscape continues moving forward, instead of forcing you back to the beginning. That's the kind of victory gardeners appreciate more with every passing season. But deer aren't the only reason parts of a landscape struggle. Sometimes the challenge has nothing to do with wildlife at all. Sometimes the challenge is simply light, or, more accurately, the lack of it. Almost every property has one. A difficult corner beneath a mature tree, a narrow side yard that rarely sees direct sunlight, an area where grass slowly disappears, no matter how many times it's reseeded. Most homeowners can picture that space immediately, because it's often the part of the yard that feels unfinished year after year. Not because people ignore it, but because nothing seems truly happy there. After enough failed attempts, many simply stop trying. The problem is that most gardening advice assumes ideal conditions: full sun, rich soil, and perfect drainage. Real landscapes rarely offer those luxuries everywhere. Every property comes with limitations, and successful gardeners eventually discover that the goal isn't to fight those limitations. It's to work with them. That's where hardy geranium quietly becomes one of the most useful plants in the garden. Unlike showy perennials that demand center stage, hardy geranium excels at solving a different kind of problem. It helps difficult spaces finally feel complete. Think about that forgotten corner for a moment. The one that's always looked disconnected from the rest of the landscape, where grass struggles, and other plants repeatedly disappoint. Now imagine walking through your yard and realizing that space no longer feels forgotten at all. Instead, it feels intentional, as though it belonged there from the very beginning. That's the transformation hardy geranium can provide. It spreads gradually, softening hard edges and connecting planting areas that might otherwise feel separate. In the process, it brings texture, color, and continuity to spaces where continuity often feels impossible to achieve. Perhaps its greatest strength, however, is how little attention it demands in return. Some plants seem to require constant negotiation: more water, more fertilizer, more maintenance, and more troubleshooting. Hardy geranium tends to ask for far less. And after enough years of gardening, that's often exactly what homeowners begin looking for. Not drama, not perfection, dependability. The ability to solve a problem quietly and consistently without creating new ones along the way. That doesn't mean hardy geranium is the flashiest plant you'll ever grow. In fact, that's part of its appeal. Its purpose isn't to dominate the landscape. Its purpose is to improve it, to make difficult spaces feel finished, to make awkward spaces feel intentional, and ultimately, to make the entire yard feel more connected. By now, a pattern is probably becoming clear. The most valuable plants aren't always the ones generating the biggest headlines in gardening magazines or social media posts. More often, they're the plants solving problems so effectively that those problems stop demanding your attention altogether. Creeping phlox transformed a difficult slope. Yarrow brought life to challenging soil. Catmint reduced the frustration caused by deer. Hardy geranium reclaimed areas where shade had been winning for years. Different plants, different challenges, different solutions. Yet every one of them points toward the same lesson. The best landscape isn't built by copying someone else's yard. It's built by understanding your own. But even after those challenges are solved, there's one final ingredient many homeowners don't realize they're missing until they experience it firsthand. Because a garden can be healthy, it can be colorful, it can even be beautifully designed, and somehow, it can still feel lifeless. That's exactly what we're going to change next. A garden can be colorful, it can be healthy, it can be filled with flowers from one end of the property to the other, and somehow, it can still feel as though something is missing. Many homeowners experience this without immediately understanding why. They spend months improving the landscape, adding new plants, filling empty spaces, and solving one problem after another. Then they step outside, expecting the yard to feel completely transformed. Instead, it simply feels better. Not remarkable, not memorable, just better. Then one day, almost without warning, something changes. A butterfly drifts through the garden. A hummingbird pauses beside a flower. Bees move from bloom to bloom throughout the afternoon. Suddenly, the landscape feels different. Not because the plants changed, but because the garden itself came alive. Movement, energy, and life begin appearing in places that once felt static. And once homeowners experience that difference, they rarely forget it. Because the most memorable gardens aren't defined only by what grows there. They're defined by what they attract. That's why some of the most successful landscapes aren't necessarily the ones with the most flowers. They're the ones that create activity, movement, and the feeling that something interesting is always happening whenever someone steps outside. Few perennials help create that experience better than bee balm. On a warm summer morning, bee balm has a way of becoming the center of attention without ever appearing to demand it. Its colorful blooms rise above the surrounding foliage, drawing butterflies, bees, and hummingbirds into the landscape throughout the season. What makes that so powerful isn't simply the visual appeal. It's the movement, the feeling that the garden is constantly changing, constantly active, and constantly rewarding homeowners for slowing down long enough to notice it. Many gardeners plant bee balm because they love the flowers. What often surprises them is how quickly they begin appreciating everything that comes with those flowers. The pollinators, the activity, the energy, the sense that the landscape is finally doing more than simply sitting there looking beautiful. And that's one of the biggest differences between a good garden and a memorable one. A good garden looks nice. A memorable garden creates experiences. Of course, bee balm performs best when it's given the conditions it prefers. One of the most common mistakes gardeners make is crowding plants too closely together and expecting them to thrive indefinitely without attention. Bee balm appreciates airflow. It appreciates space. And when those simple needs are met, it rewards homeowners with one of the most dynamic displays in the garden. But while bee balm shines during summer, another challenge begins, appearing as the season slowly changes. Many landscapes peak too early. Spring arrives, and the garden explodes with color. Early summer follows, and everything looks incredible. Then, little by little, the excitement begins fading. Flowers disappear. Color becomes harder to find. Entire sections of the landscape start blending into the background. That's the moment many homeowners realize they planned for spring, but never planned for what comes after. This is where New England aster quietly becomes one of the smartest additions to a landscape. When many gardens are beginning to slow down, New England aster is just getting started. Its blooms arrive at exactly the moment homeowners need them most, helping extend color, activity, and visual interest far beyond the point where many landscapes begin fading. The result is a garden that refuses to lose momentum. Picture walking outside in late summer and noticing that while many landscapes around the neighborhood are beginning to fade into the background, one section of your garden is still glowing with color. Pollinators are still active. Butterflies are still visiting. The yard still feels vibrant and alive. That's the gift New England aster provides. Not simply flowers, momentum. Because great landscapes aren't built around a single beautiful moment. They're built around a sequence of beautiful moments. Spring hands the spotlight to summer. Summer passes it to late summer. Late summer carries it into fall. And the garden continues telling its story, long after many others have reached the final chapter. That's exactly why bee balm and New England aster work so well together. One fills the garden with life during summer. The other extends that energy deeper into the season. Together, they help create something homeowners often want but rarely plan for. Continuity, a landscape that remains interesting month after month. By now, we've covered several a slope that constantly erodes, poor soil that makes gardening feel impossible, deer that treat flower beds like an all-you-can-eat buffet, shaded areas where almost nothing seems willing to grow, and a landscape that feels lifeless because pollinators rarely visit. If you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed something important. We never searched for the perfect perennial, because there isn't one. The internet loves universal answers. Gardening rarely works that way. The best plant for a steep hillside may be completely wrong for a shaded corner. The best solution for poor soil may make no sense somewhere else on the same property. And the plant, thriving in your neighbor's yard, may struggle in yours. That's why successful homeowners eventually stop asking, "What is the best plant?" and start asking, "What is the biggest problem my landscape needs to solve?" That single shift in thinking changes everything. If erosion is stealing soil every time it rains, creeping phlox may be exactly what the property needs. If heat and poor soil have turned gardening into a constant struggle, yarrow may finally bring reliability to the landscape. If deer have made gardening feel like an endless battle, catmint may help restore both color and peace of mind. If shade has left parts of the yard feeling forgotten, hardy geranium may finally make those spaces feel complete. And if you're hoping to create a garden filled with butterflies, hummingbirds, bees, movement, and life, bee balm and New England aster can help turn that vision into reality. Different plants, different challenges, different solutions. But ultimately, one goal: a landscape that works with you instead of against you. And that brings us back to where we started. June, the month when many homeowners begin believing they're already behind. The projects aren't finished. The weeds are still there. The empty spaces still exist. And the garden doesn't yet look the way they imagined it would. But the truth is that the most successful landscapes are rarely created in a single weekend. They're built one smart decision at a time, one solved problem at a time, and one season at a time. The slope won't always be covered in weeds. The difficult soil won't always feel impossible. The shaded corner won't always feel forgotten. And those empty spaces won't stay empty forever, because great gardens aren't created by planting more. They're created by planting smarter. If you start making those decisions today, you may be surprised by what your yard looks like by the time summer begins drawing to a close. Not because you found a perfect plant, but because you finally found the right plants for the problems your landscape was trying to solve all along.